Hey everybody, I wanted to go over our current assignment, which is the generative poster assignment. So broadly, what you need to know is our end goal is to produce three different posters. Now, these posters don't need to be necessarily connected to each other in sort of your content or your idea behind them, but the way that we go about generating them is going to be the same sort of method. So we're going to start out with a 5" by 5" artboard, and we're going to build these out in Illustrator. And it'll be helpful to think through our last assignments that we just did. Think about what worked, what didn't work when producing your dice maps or your sequences or your chance variables, and sort of use that to inform what you're doing here. It's also going to be helpful to generate a group of assets. So each poster needs to include at least 4 textures in it. And these textures, we can think about them in 4 different categories. We have our camera textures, the ones we took with our phones and edited. We have our hand-painted textures, the ones we hand-painted with the black paint. We have our pattern textures. These are the ones that we generated in Illustrator earlier in this semester. And then we have our photo montage textures. These are the ones that we developed in Photoshop, where we layered some of these other types of textures together. So we'll want to include at least these 4 images in our posters, one of each type of category. Now, you don't have to use the same 4 photos for each poster. You could switch it up, but you want to make sure you have at least one of each category of these images per poster. When you finish up a poster, you want to have something like this. So we want to have an artboard on the left here. That is our grid. Now you can just get full screen here. So you can basically just start out with an artboard and dissect it into these different sections by using basic shapes. So if we look at our shape tool here, we have rectangles, ellipses, polygons, stars. We can kind of use all these different shapes to segment off our composition into different sort of individual shapes that we can then go in and assign colors. We can assign images. We can assign colored images, or we could leave them white or black. It's sort of up to you, kind of how you go about doing this, as long as you include 4 of those images, and you do it in a way that sort of makes sense, has a logic, and you can explain it. But we don't just want to kind of do this and then put the images wherever we want, put the color wherever we want. We want to develop some sort of generative system. And here we can think about, similar to if you're coding, you have if-then statements. How can we use a multi-layered variable system to fill in our images and choose which images we want to fill in? So here I have like a dice map. So let's say I have like a 7-sided dice here. You can find different generators online that let you roll different sided dice. Let's say I had a 7-sided dice somehow. And my variables, if I rolled a 1, I could switch a shape to a new color. If I rolled a 2, I could add one of my pattern textures. If I rolled a 3, I'd add a photo montage. And you can kind of read through here what you would get for these different numbers. Now, for if I rolled a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5, the ones that I filled in with my assets up here, my textures, I have this text in blue. Now, the text in blue is a secondary variable. So if I rolled a 2, I would have to flip a coin to see which type of pattern I'm including. So I could flip a coin, and I could assign maybe heads to be a colorized version of my image, and I could do tails to be a grayscale version. So this is just a pretty simple example, but you could think through, maybe you have a dice map for which image you're assigning, and then maybe another one for color or no color, maybe another one for transformation, so we could think about what it would be like to rotate your image or rotate the shapes. So you could really kind of get pretty granular with this. I want to walk through exactly how you do this grid structure first, and that's probably going to be the best place for you to start. But I think it's going to be important that you have an artboard for your grid, and then you can just duplicate it after and kind of work on that for your poster. So here's another example down here. I'm just going to start from scratch here. I'm going to move my steps down just so you can kind of follow along. Great. So the first thing I have here is I want to generate a 5" by 5" artboard. So I have 2 of those here. But I'm just going to delete this one for now. So I've just got the one. If you don't know how to add an artboard, which you should know by now, but you can just go into Properties. If you don't see this Edit Artboard section, you have to have this first tool selected. Click on the gray, and then in Properties, you'll see the Edit Artboard section. And we can just hit plus, and it'll generate us a new artboard the same size as our previous one. For now, I'm going to stick to this one artboard. Then we want to grab a rectangle and make it the same size as our image. So I'm just going to click here, type in 5" by 5", hit OK. Now I want to have a white fill, and I don't want to have a stroke. And now that it's overlapped onto my artboard, I can just hit this align horizontal and align vertical, and then it perfectly places that rectangle on my artboard. So that's great. The next thing I want to do is pick some shapes. So maybe I just want to start out with a rectangle. Now these shapes are going to be my grid, sort of similar to this. So in my grid, I want to use no fill, and I want to have a black stroke, just so I can kind of see everything, right? So now I might go in and start to draw something that's I find kind of interesting. You can use multiple shapes. You can use different types of shapes. You can edit your shapes, kind of whatever you want to do, but the base block should always be these sort of simple shapes here. Something you could try if you're going to do this, you want to work with filled shapes. But what I could do is, let's say I had a rectangle and a star. I could actually come in here, overlap them, highlight both of these shapes. I could go into Pathfinder and hit minus front, or try one of these other blending modes, and then it's going to generate this like interesting new shape, right? That I could kind of work with, and then I could put it back to stroke, so I could kind of use it better in my composition. So maybe I like that better, actually. Maybe I want to kind of have this sort of thing happening. Maybe I want circles here. I don't want to take too long on this because I'm just kind of showing you some of the possibilities, right? And you could do something that's super symmetrical. You could do something that is not symmetrical at all. You could do something that is kind of symmetrical to one side and not the other. I think these are going to be really strong if you have some sort of concept. So maybe my concept here could be the idea of rippling and the way that water waves sort of crash into each other and interact. And the shapes sort of kind of ripple, similar to this. There's some more examples on Blackboard. So this is a pretty poor example of a grid, but you sort of get the idea. Feel free to even like overlap shapes. Kind of have fun. Let's just see what you can come up with. So yeah, this isn't great, but this will give you a concept of how to do this. So we have this strange grid here. Then I can come in and I want to select all of my black lines, but I don't want to select this rear rectangle. So the fastest way to do this is I can just click over and highlight everything. So now everything's selected, including this white rectangle. If I hold Shift and click the white rectangle, it unselects that sort of rear rectangle element. Then I can just right click on my lines. One thing to note is if you use this like sort of new shape, you might need to come in and just ungroup it before you do this step. Cool. So we come in, select, unselect our rear rectangle. Then I can do this thing called make a compound path. So we've been working with this a little bit before, but it basically just takes all these individual shapes and lines and combines them into one. Then what we do is select everything, including the white rear rectangle now. We go into Properties, Pathfinder, hit the 3 dots, and we're going to choose Divide. So now you can see all of these are now individual shapes, which is great. But they're grouped together, so we just need to come in, right-click, and ungroup. And then we just want to delete all of our shapes that go outside of our sort of border. So now that is all separated, we can come in, add in a black stroke with no fill, and we've got our grid ready to go, ready to put images and apply our generative system. So to duplicate that, to kind of add in, we can go here and duplicate it. And for the one that I'm working on for the poster, it'll be helpful to not have a stroke, but to be completely filled in. So we have the grid here for reference. Looks like I missed a little shape here. Cool. So we have the grid over to the left for reference, and then we have our version over here that we're able to kind of fill things in. So the general idea is that we'd be able to pull in our images. So let's say I wanted to, my pattern told me that I should use this image first. So I can drag my image in, make sure it's underneath all my shapes. And then I can select, let's say I want to select this shape. So I'll hold Shift. You can tell my image is still selected by this like cross section here. And then I can hold Shift and select the shape that I want to use as my mask. And just like last time, we can come in, right click, and make a clipping mask. And now that image shows up just on that little section. So this is great, but what if I want to, let's say, this little ring here. What if I wanted to use this whole ring, right, to kind of fill that ring in with this image? Well, just like our last assignment, I'll highlight all of those. I'll right click and I can hit make compound path. Now this ring is kind of all one unit. Let's try this image this time. So I'm going to duplicate that in here. Then with it still selected, I can hold Shift and click my shape, right click, make clipping mask, and now that image is inside of that shape, which is great. Now, when you're doing this, something to kind of think about is, do I want my image to be the full scale of my artboard? Or do I kind of want to scale it down to be just the size of the element that we're using? It's kind of totally up to you. So that's one thing you can think of. The other thing too you could think of is you saw that in the grid section earlier, up on my first poster here, if I turn on this layer, I have all these letters here, and you can see some of these in the Blackboard example as well. So maybe I have A, B, C. And you could use these in several different ways, but one of the ways I was thinking about it is, let's say, instead of just rolling the dice for every single shape, maybe you wanted to have shapes that have a similar outcome. So you could say maybe this shape here, all the ones that have the label A, when I roll my dice, I could fill in those shapes with the same outcome. So then I'm starting to group my image in different ways. And that's something else you could randomize and leave to chance, where you could sort of just randomly assign it on your own. But that's another kind of thing you can think through. But ultimately, our goal here is going to be to generate these 3 posters. We want an artboard with a grid, an artboard with our final poster design. Feel free to use color. Feel free to use different images that you've made throughout the semester, and all that sort of stuff. The last thing I'll say is we've also learned all these techniques for manipulating images too, right? So we aren't necessarily just stuck with these images that we have that we've made so far. So one thing we could do is jump into Photoshop and distort them in some way. So let's say I pull up this image from Photoshop, and let's say I use ripple, right? So I could kind of play around with the settings here. Or I could, I don't know, let's try something that's a little bit more obvious. It's like twirl. So here we have this filter that kind of twirls our pixels. So maybe I want to use that. And maybe I have a version that's the normal image and a version that's my edited image. Or I have a version that's black and white. And then I go in and I have a duotone image using this gradient map feature, where I pick a couple of different colors. And then I apply that to my composition. These are all sort of things you guys can think through. There's a ton of creative freedom in this project. If you're feeling stuck, try to find inspiration in some of your interests. And the other thing you can do is check out on Blackboard all these different examples. So here is sort of our directions. And then if you follow through, everything underneath that are different student examples in the past. Some are pretty simple, and then others are way more complex. But you can see how interesting this assignment can be and the work that it can produce. This one is an example of somebody who did distortions in Photoshop, and you could even read through people's thinking behind and some of their logic that went through to make these different designs. Great. Can't wait to see what you all produce.